Part 1. The Kansas Frontier Before the Benders. Before there were graves in the orchard, before the canvas partition and the heavy hammer, before the name Bender became shorthand for a special kind of American horror, there was only land, wide, unfinished, and waiting. Kansas in the late 1860s was not yet a place. It was an argument. It existed in the American mind as a promise and a threat at the same time. A promise of land without end, of ownership wrested directly from the soil by one's own hands. A threat of isolation, hunger, violence, and disappearance so complete that a man might vanish without leaving even a rumor behind. Maps were optimistic lies. Lines drawn by surveyors cut cleanly across prairies that did not acknowledge them. Roads were suggestions. Law was provisional. The Civil War had ended, but its consequences were still moving west like aftershocks. Men who had learned to kill efficiently returned home unable to remain still. Some carried pensions and uniforms, others carried only habits, watchfulness, suspicion, and the knowledge that violence solved problems faster than words. They went west not because they loved adventure, but because they could not tolerate crowds, rules, or memory. Kansas absorbed them. The defining feature of southeastern Kansas was not settlement but movement. The land lay astride one of the great informal arteries of post-war America, a rough corridor running from Missouri toward the Indian Territory. It carried settlers, traders, freighters, doctors, preachers, confidence men, gamblers, widows with children, and veterans who preferred to sleep under the sky rather than in houses with walls thin enough to echo the past. The road between Fort Scott and Independence was not a road in the modern sense. It was a scar. Wagon wheels bit into the sod year after year, widening it not by design but by erosion and repetition. Rain turned it into mud. Heat baked it into stone. No mile markers marked progress. Travelers counted distance by exhaustion. To vanish on such a road was not unusual. To vanish without trace was not alarming. To vanish repeatedly was something else, but it took time for that realization to coalesce. The frontier did not count its dead carefully. Osage Township in Labette County was neither lawless nor primitive, but it was unfinished. Its residents were people who believed, not unreasonably, that civilization was something you built yourself or did without. They constructed their homes plank by plank, raised barns by mutual agreement, and shared labor when it was practical. Entertainment was functional: barn raisings, revivals, spelling bees. Gossip traveled faster than letters, but slower than suspicion. A stranger was greeted politely and watched carefully. These were not people prone to hysteria. They had survived war, drought, and failure. Many had buried children without ceremony. They did not imagine monsters easily. Which is why the Benders were able to exist among them. On the frontier, trust was not philosophical. It was transactional. If a traveler stopped at your door and you fed him, he was expected to pay, to leave peacefully, and not to return with friends who asked questions. If you stopped at someone else's door, you accepted that you were placing your safety in their hands. There were no hotels, no standardized inspections, no police patrols. An inn was not merely a business. It was a social node. It functioned as store, post office, meeting place, and rumor mill. A family that ran such a place acquired a form of soft power. They knew who passed through, when, and alone. This made inns indispensable and dangerous. Modern readers often struggle to understand how 11, 20, or even 40 murders could occur without immediate alarm. The answer is unromantic. Records were weak, and absence was common. Travelers rarely announced itineraries. Letters were irregular. A man might sell his property, head west, and never be heard from again without anyone assuming foul play. He might have died of cholera, been robbed and left in a ravine, joined another community, or crossed into Indian Territory under a new name. The frontier normalized ambiguity. Only when absences clustered, only when patterns emerged, did the idea of deliberate murder begin to form. Even then, suspicion was tempered by practicality. Accusing a neighbor meant risking retaliation or social fracture. Accusing a business that everyone relied on was worse. The frontier was populated by people who had seen bodies, piled without names. Civil War veterans had learned that death could be anonymous, industrial, and morally complex. Killing had been legitimized by uniform and command. When the war ended, the habits remained even as the justifications vanished. Some men returned home softened, others returned sharpened. Kansas drew the latter. This matters because the response to the Benders, whether official or unofficial, cannot be understood without this context. The same society that tolerated uncertainty for years could, under the right conditions, move suddenly and decisively toward collective violence. Vigilantism was not an aberration. It was a contingency plan. By the early 1870s, southeastern Kansas was rich in one resource above all others: people in transit with money. Land sales, military pensions, livestock trades, and cash transactions made travelers tempting targets. Many carried their wealth on their person. Banks were scarce. Theft was common. Murder was not unheard of. But systematic murder, murder disguised as hospitality, required more than brutality. It required patience, discipline, and a deep understanding of human behavior. It required a family. Before the Benders arrived, Osage Township already contained the ingredients necessary for catastrophe. A busy road with little oversight. A population accustomed to minding its own business. A culture that valued hospitality but did not verify it. A legal system distant enough to be optional. And a collective memory shaped by war. What it lacked was a mechanism. That mechanism would take the form of a modest house set back from the road, divided by canvas, surrounded by an orchard whose soil would one day remember what the living tried to forget. The frontier did not create the Benders, but it made them possible, like in Follow for Part 2,